see we have Secretary Advisor here from the Department of Environmental Quality. Good morning, Secretary. Department of Transportation. Department of Commerce.
Hey, it's Jordan Wichard for Commerce.
Good morning, Jordan. Thank you.
Morning.
Department of Administration. Department of Public Safety.
Doug Holbrook, for Public Safety.
Good morning, Doug.
Hey.
Department of Health and Human Services. Department of Natural and Cultural Resources.
Yeah, Jeff Michael, Deputy Secretary of Natural Resources, representing DNCR.
Thank you. Department of Military and Veterans Affairs. Department of Revenue. And Department of Information Technology. Secretary Advisor, if you're ready, we can begin.
Thank you, Sharon, and good morning, everyone. So as Council Chair, I'll now officially call this meeting of the Climate Change Interagency Council to order. Since we met last, Governor Cooper signed Executive Order 246, affirming North Carolina's commitment to a clean energy economy that benefits every community in our state. It's building on the success of EO 80 and House Bill 951, and it sets ambitious climate goals. And it solidifies the administration's commitment to public engagement and environmental justice and equity. So we're going to hear more about the implementation of Executive Order 246 in just a few minutes. Also on our agenda today is an update from Governor Cooper's recommended budget, which includes funding to address climate change, transition to a clean energy economy, and funding to build more resilient communities. And finally, we'll hear an update on our progress to improve energy efficiency in state buildings, which is one of the goals that was set out in Executive Order 80. So through executive order and bipartisan legislation, North Carolina has taken bold action on climate change and set ambitious climate goals, including net zero carbon emissions by 2050. As we all know, the only way that we're going to achieve these goals is by working collaboratively and with a whole of government approach. We've come a long way since EO 80 was signed in 2018, but there is still a lot more work to be done to address the impacts of climate change and to protect North Carolina communities. So now, as long as we are through our tech issues, I'm going to turn it over to Governor Cooper's Policy Office for an update on Executive Order 246. Jeremy, I believe that is you.
Great, thank you, Secretary, and good morning, everybody. I'm Jeremy Tarr, Senior Advisor for Climate Change Policy in the Governor's Office. As the Secretary mentioned, Governor Cooper issued Executive Order 246 in January earlier this year. Wanted to take a few minutes just to walk through, kind of give you a high-level overview of it. This executive order builds upon prior actions by the governor since 2018 to address climate change. Those include things like Executive Order 80, which was released in October 2018, and multiple actions across the governor's cabinet to implement Executive Order 80. Also, Executive Order 143 in 2020, which established the Andrea Harris Task Force to address disproportionate impacts on communities of color. He's also released Executive Order 218 in about a year ago that set the state's first offshore wind goals and directed actions for North Carolina to capture the economic and clean energy benefits of offshore wind. And then last fall, Governor Cooper signed House Bill 951, bipartisan legislation that, among other things, requires regulated electric utilities to achieve a 70% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions by 2030, and then carbon neutrality by 2050. So EO 246 is an additional layer on top of those ongoing initiatives. It directs the state to take significant next steps on climate change and environmental justice. It's important to note this executive order addresses both topics together, and in fact, visually, the provisions on each of those two topics are kind of interwoven throughout the executive order. These two are addressed together because climate action, and environmental justice are so intertwined. And achieving equitable, durable emission reductions and resilience really requires advances in environmental justice at the same time. I won't go through every provision in the EO. I encourage you to look over it if you haven't already. But the dozen or so provisions in Executive Order 246 really fall into 4 different buckets. The first is climate change related goals. So it sets a goal of 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions across North Carolina's economy, all sectors, by 2030, and sets a goal of achieving net zero emissions economy-wide as soon as possible, no later than 2050. And these goals, layered on top of the EO 80 goals, are consistent with the latest climate science. B, it sets goals for an increase in the total number of registered zero-emission vehicles in North Carolina to at least 1.25 million by 2030, and sets a goal that 50% of in-state vehicle sales will be zero-emission vehicles by 2030. The second bucket is on environmental justice, and here the order includes a number of concrete actions on environmental justice really across the administration to help increase our understanding and awareness of environmental justice issues, to better coordinate among state agencies, to improve transparency and communication between the state and communities and other stakeholders, and to ensure that we're making decisions that benefit underserved communities. And Jimmy Bellamy is going to give us a status update and talk through some of the specific environmental justice directives. The third bucket is taking new steps on climate in addition to those already underway. So it directed DEQ to release an updated greenhouse gas inventory, which it did in late January. And that inventory shows that transportation is now and has been for a number of years the largest greenhouse gas emitting sector in North Carolina. The order directs new action on transportation, in particular development of a clean transportation plan, which Zach Pierce from the governor's office is going to talk about in a few minutes. It directs a development of a net zero decarbonization pathways analysis, again, which Zach will talk more about in a few minutes. And it addresses a number of issues like climate and public health, opportunities for the state to consider the societal cost of greenhouse gas emissions in our state agency decision making. The fourth bucket is on workforce and economic topics. So the order directs agencies to invest federal and state funding with an emphasis on achieving the directives in EO 246, EO 80, particularly when it comes to emission reductions, resilience, environmental justice, job creation, and health equity. Another provision directs this body, the Climate Council, to establish a work group to help improve workforce diversity in climate-related fields. And Andrea from our office is going to talk more about that in a few minutes. We recognize that while climate change impacts diverse populations first and often worst, we could use more diversity in climate-related fields that are critical to helping solve the challenges of climate change. And then still in the environmental kind of bucket, economic and workforce bucket, it directs the governor's office in Commerce and Department of Environmental Quality to partner with others to create new clean energy youth apprenticeship programs and at least 5 additional learning sites. And we're very excited about expanding this program. So with that high-level overview, I'll turn it over to Jimmy and then I believe Andrea and Zach to talk more about some of the provisions that I just mentioned.
Thanks, Jeremy. Can you all hear me?
We do, Jimmy, loud and clear.
All right, great. Thank you. So yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Jimmy Bellamy, and I'm one of the governor's policy advisors. And so I just want to take a few minutes and give you a brief update on some of the environmental justice work that we have been doing and are planning to do. So as you recall, Executive Order 246 really reaffirmed North Carolina's commitment to basically transitioning to a clean, equitable economy. And a number of those provisions highlighted the need to do more on environmental justice and equity. And so with that, the governor directed agencies to do a number of things to sort of push forward on environmental justice. And so one was for agencies to incorporate environmental justice considerations into agency decision-making. Two was for agencies to appoint environmental justice and equity leads. Three was for basically agencies to develop a public participation plan to enhance transparency and really allow for more opportunities for meaningful engagement with communities, especially those communities that have been historically left out of that participatory process in state government and agency decision-making. And the last sort of provision that he directed on environmental justice was essentially for the governor's office to convene a community stakeholder process to inform future executive action that he could take on environmental justice and equity issues. And so basically to present date, what has been accomplished is that all cabinet agencies have appointed their environmental justice and equity leads. And I believe that most of these appointed individuals are at the assistant secretary level. And DEQ actually has a link or on a list on their website with their contact information and names for each agency. So that's been accomplished. And recently, a few weeks ago, the agencies, they released their public participation plans for public comment as directed by the Executive Order 246. And so if you recall, some of you may recall, the governor's office engaged with the Regulatory Assistance Project to develop basically a model participation plan for agencies to use. I think at that point, DEQ was the only agency that already had a public participation plan in place. So we thought it would be helpful to have a sort of a model plan for other agencies to sort of look at and work off of as they develop their own plans. And so during the course of our engagement with the Regulatory Assistance Project, we hosted sort of like a public survey to receive public input on the development of that model participation plan. And also, we worked with the Regulatory Assistance Project to deliver training to the environmental justice leads and to their agencies on how to best implement public participation best practices. And so what we're doing right now, what we're really focusing on right now is training, getting training for the environmental justice leads and agency leadership, and working to convene this community stakeholder process. And so for the past couple of months, we've really been working hard to sort of secure some of the funding to make sure that we're providing quality training and making sure that this community stakeholder process is of quality. And so recently, I think we've gotten to a place where we're in a really good spot to move forward on more of the actionable work for the training and for the community stakeholder process. And so I'm hoping to get some of this work started here in July. So with training from a very high level, I think we're, one, prioritizing to do this training because it's going to be really important to have this training to sort of establish that foundational knowledge with the environmental justice leads, with the agencies, and with the governor's office, right? And so sort of broad strokes, training is going to focus on understanding some of the historical root causes of environmental justice, specifically within that North Carolina context. The training is going to focus on looking at some of the legal framework and the statutory basis for a lot of the environmental justice laws or environmental justice actions that we have. And then it's going to look at some of the current day issues around environmental justice or environmental injustice, such as cumulative impacts, and looking at permitting decisions and regulatory aspects of environmental justice. And then lastly, just sort of zooming out, the training is really just going to focus on a whole of government approach and examine the role that state government has and each agency has in advancing environmental justice. So that's in the works. That's what we're working on to sort of do that with training. And I think right now we're looking to do at least a 2-day in-person event with the environmental justice leads and some of the agency leadership on this to sort of move forward on that. And then the next thing that we're working on is the community stakeholder process. And so with that, we're going to be working with agencies, especially with DEQ, and looking at to the Secretary's Environmental Justice and Equity Board and some of the environmental justice leads to really help define how this process should look. But we are at a very high level envisioning a series of stakeholder events, likely in different locations with, in-person and virtual options to ensure maximum participation. And really the goal of this stakeholder process is to really identify and prioritize those key issues and recommendations for future executive action on environmental justice. But also I think these events are really going to be a great opportunity to provide space for meaningful opportunities for community members as well as state government to really voice concerns and have a constructive dialogue and provide recommendations on what the state should be doing to advance environmental justice. And so we're excited about the work. It's a lot of work that needs to be done, understanding that when Executive Order 246 was signed, we understood as far as environmental justice and equity that this was just a first step. So we're excited about taking more steps to advance this work down the road. And so with that, I'll pause and turn it over to, I believe, Andrea is next.
Thank you so much, Jimmy, and thank you all for having me here today. My name is Andrea DeSantis. I'm a policy advisor in the governor's office and work closely around our initiatives for higher education and workforce. And so, as Jeremy mentioned, one of the provisions in EO 246 calls for the creation of a work group to identify strategies for increasing workforce diversity in the industries and occupations that are most closely connected with addressing climate change. And as part of that work group, they've been asked to provide a report within 9 months of the EO. And so we're really excited to start work with this work group and pulling together a diverse group of stakeholders. We know that climate change, as Jeremy mentioned, bursts and often impacts communities of color and those who are traditionally underserved and underrepresented. And so making sure that from the outset, we're being really thoughtful about how to engage these communities in this up and coming workforce is going to be essential to the success of our work here in the state. I first want to thank the North Carolina Department of Commerce for providing leadership and staffing of this work group. There's a great group of staff members there that have agreed to take this on and have really pulled together a nice structure for the work group. We're also pleased to share that Dr. Greg Monty, professor and director for the Center of Energy Research and Technology at North Carolina A&T, has agreed to serve as the chair for this work group. So Dr. Monty, which some of you may be familiar with his work, he has a wealth of experience when it comes to the clean energy sector and has really been a champion for diversity, equity, inclusion, and access initiatives. And most specifically and recently with us, he's worked on the clean energy youth apprenticeship opportunities that are being hosted this summer. Right now, we are working to finalize the rest of the work group, which will include members from across the clean energy industry. It will also include our education partners across the K-12, community college, and college and university pipeline, as well as environmental justice advocates and representatives from historically underserved and underrepresented communities. Right now, as we're finalizing that work group in the next few weeks, we're also getting our first meeting on the calendars for early July. And so this work group will meet regularly throughout the summer and early fall to create a report and really drive conversations internally about what's already happening in the state, what are some best practices and promising practices that we can draw on to diversify the clean energy workforce. And we'll be providing that report in early fall. So happy to answer any questions about this. Also, I think now I'll pass it over to Zach Pierce from our office.
Thanks, Andrea. Folks hear me okay? Seeing head nodding. Okay, great. Good morning. My name is Zach Pierce. I also serve as an advisor on Governor Cooper's policy team. And I'm going to somewhat briefly walk through two of the initiatives that were also articulated in EO 246, the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Analysis and the North Carolina Clean Transportation Plan. I'll try to give a high-level overview, and then, of course, I'm happy to connect offline or answer any questions to go into further detail. Starting with the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Analysis. So, before I get into the specifics of the analysis and the status update, I just wanted to talk a bit about the motivation for this project, which I'll just refer to as the Pathways Analysis. So, as Jeremy mentioned, this was directed in Executive Order 246. And it was really motivated by an acknowledgement that there's been significant progress on sector-specific planning and an opportunity to complement that sector-specific analysis by evaluating pathways to achieve the state's greenhouse gas targets by taking a step back and looking more holistically at the entire economy. And so this type of analysis, and I'll talk a little bit more specifically about what the analysis encompasses, but broadly speaking, the objective of this analysis is to lead to updated insights for sectors that have already been closely scrutinized, like the power sector through efforts like the Clean Energy Plan, but also to evaluate new sectors that haven't received as much modeling and attention, for sectors like the built environment and industrial sources of greenhouse gas emissions. We also want to look more closely at interactions between sectors and across the economy. Perhaps the most prevalent topic that folks are talking about these days when we talk about the interaction between sectors is the electrification of vehicles and the move to zero emission vehicles. And so understanding those interactions between the transportation sector and the power sector is going to continue to be a really important point of analysis and stakeholder engagement. And ultimately, with this modeling, we want to distill policy and planning takeaways that will inform decision-making processes like the Clean Transportation Plan. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple minutes here. But distilling policy and planning takeaways like what are the no regrets actions that we clearly need to take in the near term, regardless of long-term divergences and pathways based on different technology deployment or demographic trends. And conversely, what are those actions that we know are incompatible with our greenhouse gas emissions or goals across the economy, regardless of long-term divergences in the pathways? So that's the kind of high-level motivation and the why for the inclusion of this project in EO 246. In terms of the project itself, and how it's set up. So, in terms of internal governance, the governor's office is leading the development of this project, and we've convened an interagency steering committee with representation from many of the agencies represented on the Climate Council, but the Department of Environmental Quality, Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, Department of Transportation, and Department of Commerce. And this group is really the state team that's helping to guide and facilitate the project. We've finalized a contract with a third-party consultant that is really going to help us do the majority of the modeling and the analytical work, as well as providing technical expertise and support for implementing the project. So what they'll be doing is basically modeling up to 3 illustrative hypothetical pathways, all comprised of different technology deployments across the economy, other considerations like land use changes, but consistent in terms of meeting the administration's 2030 and 2050 greenhouse gas targets that are articulated in EO 246. And then these pathways will be compared to a business as usual scenario that also projects emissions through 2050, and we can start to dig into some of the deployments of various technologies, the trends that we see both in business as usual trends, as well as hypothetical versions of North Carolina's statewide emissions that are on track to achieve the goals that we've established. In terms of stakeholder engagement, this is a really important facet of the project, we basically have three primary venues for stakeholder engagement. So we've assembled a technical advisory group that's going to be meeting throughout the project and providing more technical feedback on the modeling itself and the pathways, as well as providing insights into the draft modeling results and ultimately the final report that's going to be submitted to the governor by January of next year. And so this is a group of about 15, 16 representatives from academia, from industry, covering all the sectors that will be modeled as part of the analysis, as well as public interest stakeholders. So representation from the environmental justice community, consumer advocates, and environmental advocacy. So that's the first bucket, technical advisory group. The second is really going to be targeted stakeholder outreach. We know that, there are a lot of constituencies out there that are going to have a real interest in this project, and we want to ensure that we are meeting early and often with those groups to ultimately ensure that this project and this analysis is something that adds value to the work that everyone is doing in this space to support the governor's greenhouse gas emissions goals. So we'll be conducting targeted stakeholder outreach throughout the coming months, and I would just note if you're on the line and you feel like there's a specific constituency that you want to make sure that we are engaging with, we would love to hear that. And then finally, we will be conducting or hosting basically broad public stakeholder meetings, town hall style events, so that anyone who's interested can join a public information session to both hear from the state team and our contractor about where the project is in process, what the scope of the project is, and as well as providing feedback to ultimately inform the final pathways analysis. So we're really excited about this project. There's been a lot of work going on to move it forward. And if you'd like to learn more, please reach out to me. We know that to make this, like I said, a value add for folks, that we need to not complete the report in a vacuum and really get out there and make sure that we're understanding the perspectives from diverse stakeholders, so that ultimately this analytical process can be used in other venues where state decision makers and the public are just making decisions about state policy and actions to advance the administration's climate, clean energy economy, and environmental justice objectives. So I'm going to let me pause there to see if there are any questions from the council. Okay, I will quickly pivot to the North Carolina Clean Transportation Plan. And this will be brief because I'm going to put a plug in for an upcoming in-depth public engagement session for the North Carolina Clean Transportation Plan. But before I go into the plan itself, I just wanted to quickly provide some broader context. Since the last Climate Council meeting, the 2022 greenhouse gas inventory was released from DEQ, and that report highlighted that in both North Carolina and nationally, the transportation sector has surpassed the power sector as the leading source of greenhouse gas emissions. So the 2022 inventory shows that the transportation sector has been the state's leading source of emissions since 2016, and it currently accounts for about 36% of gross emissions statewide. In addition to being the top contributor to greenhouse gases, we also know that transportation emissions also contribute significantly to harmful air pollution like particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, other air toxics that negatively impact the health and well-being of all North Carolinians, but especially historically underserved communities, low-income communities, communities of color, and other historically underserved communities. And so you've heard from our team this morning about the importance of focusing on both on our climate and greenhouse gas objectives, but the broader environmental justice context and equity context that we must be integrating into our work. And so the transportation sector is a really good example of moving the needle in both of those areas. Additionally, we're seeing huge economic and job growth opportunities that come with leading the transition to cleaner technologies in the transportation sector. It's hard to keep up with the announcements, but ranging from folks up and down the supply chain to manufacturers like Toyota and VinFast. And so we want to continue to lead on that market-driven transition to ensure that North Carolinians benefit, our economy benefits, and we're growing local jobs. So for these reasons, Executive Order 246 established new targets for the transportation sector and directed the development of North Carolina's first clean transportation plan. So in terms of the new targets, the EO directed 1.25 million zero-emission vehicles by 2030, which is a goal that has been greatly increased from the 80,000 vehicles by 2025 target established in EO 80. The governor also established a sales goal of having 50% of passenger cars and light duty trucks sales be zero emission by 2030. So a really big increase in the level of ambition that reflects both the transition of the market and the maturation of the market, as well as the public policy imperative to lead on this work. So going back to the Clean Transportation Plan, just quickly note that our Department of Transportation, which is represented on the line today, has been leading the development of this Clean Transportation Plan, convening dozens of stakeholders. I want to say hundreds of stakeholders. I think that's accurate across the state, and are really in the midst of working, these substantive work groups across topics to develop recommendations for actionable strategies that the state should be pursuing to achieve these high-level targets, whether that's vehicle sales, greenhouse gas emissions, or some of the stated commitments to environmental justice and equity. This is not just about the transition of vehicles to zero-emission vehicles. These groups are looking at light duty vehicles, the medium and heavy duty vehicles, which is a critical subsector that hosts, the most polluting vehicles on the road, especially when it comes to local air pollution. Looking at fleet transitions, reducing vehicle miles traveled, and thinking about the efficiency of our transportation system, as well as the infrastructure, the charging, and the low and zero carbon fuels that we know are going to require significant planning and technology deployment to support the coming stock of vehicles. The plan is also going to be focusing on a number of cross-cutting themes. I've spoken about environmental justice and equity, but also looking at things like education and outreach, workforce, the health impacts, policies and programs that could support this work. So it's a really exciting time, and this really is the opportunity, I think, for the public and for all of our agencies to coalesce around the vision that the governor has set and get into the details of really distilling actionable strategies that are going to help move the needle towards those stated objectives. So I'm going to wrap up. I will drop a link after I conclude here, but I just wanted to flag that on June 28th, so next week, the Department of Transportation is hosting their second of, I believe, 4 public meetings to walk in more detail through the Clean Transportation Plan, the progress to date, what's next, and we're also actually going to have our contractor for the pathways analysis and the state team on the pathways analysis to provide a presentation to help the public understand how we see the linkage between these two projects, which is really critical because we see the Clean Transportation Plan as one of the first decision-making processes that could benefit from the pathways analysis. So I will stop there, answer any questions, and otherwise turn it back over to Jeremy.
Thanks, Zach. So we're going to move to our next budget item, which will be short, but wanted to talk a bit about the Governor Cooper's recommended budget. Earlier this spring, he released his expansion budget for the second year of our biennium. And like his proposed budget a year earlier, it includes numerous items to help move the state forward on topics we've been discussing this morning. Climate mitigation, also resilience, environmental protection, justice, economic development. I think the big picture here is that his budgets really show that we can invest in these priorities and other priorities with responsible fiscal management and maintaining a balanced budget. This budget expansion recommendation document, it includes $140 million for clean energy and environmental needs. So that within that, there's $92 million for natural and working lands. There's $22 million for clean transportation. There's $15 million for advancing environmental justice and $13 million for clean energy type projects. I won't go through a long list, but highlights include investments in some of these following items. So land in Poquoson and peatland conservation and recreation, restoration, state projects programs that really help regional and local governments with resilience planning, but also with project design and implementation. Budget items to advance integrated mobility, rail and bike ped modes. There's budget items to support community engagement in the processes that we're talking about this morning. Clean energy initiatives for low-income households, for schools, for community colleges, and for state government. There are budget items on infrastructure investments to help pull down federal funds and to help support clean industries. There's investments for swine floodplain buyout program, as well as agricultural programs that are really important for land management, especially forests. And also investments in our state's 3 energy centers, which are at NC State, App State, and North Carolina A&T. So it looks like budget negotiations may come to an end over the next week or so. I'd encourage you, if you haven't taken a look at the governor's recommended expansion budget, to do so. Now's the time to express support for it. So I'd encourage that as well. I think it's sort of inherent in these kind of processes, but budget decisions really require evaluating difficult trade-offs among a number of priorities. But again, overall, I think the governor's budget shows that we really can advance these priorities and be fiscally responsible at the same time while we're moving forward on policy initiatives. I know the cabinet agencies on the line, just thank you for your ongoing work and with your teams to advance governor's priorities across the board, but including on the ones we're talking about here today, as you develop your budget process, your proposed budgets, but also implementation throughout the year. It's really important. Thank you for lifting these priorities up. To stakeholders, also want to thank you for many, many points of constructive engagement and ideas that you've shared with agencies, with the governor's office, with our budget office, when it comes to budgeting and other fiscal issues. So happy to talk more about, answer any questions now or talk offline with folks if helpful, but just want to take a few minutes to underscore that as the governor moves forward on these climate, environmental justice issues, it's not just through policy, it's also through the budget process, which is really important. With that, Secretary, I'll turn it back over to you.
Sorry. The next item on our agenda is state building efficiency. So let me turn it over to Matthew Davis. Matthew?
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for putting the slides up. So I'm Matthew Davis. I'm with the State Energy Office and Department of Environmental Quality, and also with me is Julie Pfeiffer, who's is on standby as well. So today we're going to provide a brief update about where we currently are with our state-owned buildings with our reductions under statute for one and under Executive Order 80 for as number 2. So we look forward to providing you with a quick update. So next slide, please. All right, so just to give a little context and set the table for this discussion, as you all know, Executive Order 80 was implemented back in 2018, and it has, one of the key goals in it was, a 40% reduction in energy use intensity about 40% of fiscal year 2002 to 2003 levels. This builds on the existing statutory requirement of a 30% reduction by 2015, based on the same baseline of 2002 to 2003. And one thing I will note before we move on is you're going to see an acronym that will be on many slides in this, which is Energy Use Intensity, or EUI. And what this is it's really your building's annual consumption relative to the gross square footage, or otherwise known as your thermal energy, or BTUs over your square footage, a BTU per gross square foot. Next slide, please. And one other thing I would mention before I dive into this one is that state-owned buildings, just for a little bit more context, consist of 21 UNC system schools and constituent institutions, as well as 14 state agencies. And then while we collect data from 58 community colleges, they're considered local government and are not included as part of the results of this update. So some of the key accomplishments that we've had during this past fiscal year, just to dive right on in, is we've saved, what we didn't use, $8.7 million less than the previous fiscal year in spending. So that's awesome. But also, when compared to the baseline of 2002 to 2003, just for this one fiscal year, we avoided $161 million in utility costs, which is a great accomplishment. Next, when compared to the collective items since 2002 to 2003 for all fiscal years combined, we have avoided roughly 900,000 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions and CO2 equivalency. And just for context of that, that is essentially the annual carbon dioxide emissions from 2 coal-fired power plants. One other thing that's great is all fiscal years combined for avoided cost, $1.6 billion with a B has been avoided since the baseline. So just for context for avoided, what it means is that this is the amount of money that would have been paid or emissions that would have been put out into the environment if we had not implemented energy conservation measures over time. Next slide, please. All right, so now we're going to go into a little bit, we're going to stay at all state-owned buildings and then we're going to dive into cabinet agencies a little bit later. But for this slide, we're going to show the proportion of spending and consumption for state-owned buildings. So on the pie chart on the left, you'll see that there are 3 different categories. We have the UNC system, cabinet agencies, and other agencies. So as you can see, the UNC system has a large proportion of the spending, which is roughly the same proportion of energy consumption. So keep that in mind. So the spending and energy consumption are roughly the same on this graph. So that's why we didn't make a separate pie chart for that. So cabinet agencies make up 30%. So cabinet agencies have a lot of weight in the overall total or average for spending and consumption. Whereas the other agencies, which are we define as non-cabinet agencies, or those that are not affiliated with cabinet agencies, are roughly 2%. So they don't have, they are meaningful, but they don't have as much of an impact as the cabinet agencies in the UNC system. So just on the right-hand side of the screen for this table, you'll see that overall spending during this past fiscal year, for fiscal year 2020 to 2021, cabinet agencies were $90 million, and the UNC system was $204 million. And overall, statewide, we were at $300 million. So just to put that into context, that is roughly $800,000 per day in spending on utilities, or the equivalent of buying a new vehicle every hour by the state of North Carolina. So these are large numbers, and these are things that which emphasizes the importance of energy management, energy conservation, and environmental preservation. Next slide, please. All right, so this slide has a lot of information. We're going to try to break it down. But one thing that I would like to mention is that right now, as you can see on this is a status update for where we are in fiscal year 2020 to 2021 when compared to the baseline year of 2002 to 2003. So when you look at this data, this is in our most recent report that was published in December of 2021. But as you can see, the gross square footage across the board has increased. Statewide, 46%. But what we did was we broke it out into different sectors, as we just saw in the previous slide, which cabinet agencies, other agencies in the UNC system. So currently, cabinet agencies, while their square footage has increased, their EUI has also has decreased, but we're at a 23%. So when you compare that to the UNC system, where their square footage has increased 63%, and then their reduction since the baseline in EUI is 36, that shows a difference in mindset. So if you look at the numbers, the UNC system is, their square footage increased by, roughly 2.5 times of that of the cabinet agencies, while they reduced their energy use intensity by 1.5 times during that same time period. So if you look at this data, you'll see that at the current trajectory right now, we are not on track to meet this goal by 2025 if nothing is done to push us along. So one other thing that you'll see on the slide is you'll see the red in the middle, which is this other agencies, and it's at 4%. You're saying, well, what's up with that? Well, what's going on with this is the other agencies, well, one, they're such a small piece of the grand total. They're only 2% of everything. So overall, even if they significantly increase their EUI, it really doesn't have that much of an impact on the collective total. So most of our efforts in the State Energy Office and DEQ has been on cabinet agencies in the UNC system because they're the heavy hitters. And statewide right now, we're at a 31% reduction. So we still have a ways to go before we can hit the 40% goal by 2025. Next slide, please. All right, so just to dive, okay, so we were just at statewide, so now we're going to dive right on into cabinet agencies and focus a little bit here. So what we call this slide is really percent impact, and what this means is it's basically a ratio of individual agency BTU per gross square foot, compared that to the collective total for all cabinet agencies combined for their BTU per gross square foot. So it's a ratio. So one agency over the whole total, collective total of cabinet agencies. So one thing that you'll quickly notice is that DPS, and DHHS, DOT, DOA, and DNCR are the real heavy hitters here. These are what we call the big five. And these 5 agencies comprise 98% of the total impact for all cabinet agencies in North Carolina. And in fact, all agencies, including the other agencies. So this provides a lot of context for where a lot of our efforts have been focused over the past few years, because we're getting the most bang for our buck with focusing on these and having the most reductions over time. Next slide, please. So cabinet agency EUI. Now you just saw where the proportion of the consumption is and per BT per square foot. So now we're going to kind of dive into where we've been over time. We're going to take a time trip real quick. So if you look over here on this slide, you'll see that since the base year of 2002 all the way up to where we are now, we have decreased for cabinet agencies. But you'll quickly notice that in 2015, once the statutory goal passed, or the statutory deadline of 2015 passed for that 30% goal, the agency started to lose progress and started to uptick on that graph. And ever since that time, when Executive Order 80 came into play in 2018, you start to see the trend decrease, which is good. But as you can see, we're still having to make up progress that we already made, which is a problem. Right now, if you look at this graph, we should be on this blue line or this blue trajectory to be able to meet the EO 80, or at least to provide a proportionate amount of our of cabinet agencies to the contributions. If they were on that blue line, they would have a fair proportion for contributing to the goal of the statewide collective total. But one thing I would like to mention as well is that once that 2015 deadline passed, when all the agencies were left to their own devices and that everything passed, you can tell that energy efficiency did not become a priority, and it wasn't a mindset until Executive Order 80 came into play. So as you may recall on the previous few slides, during this exact same time frame, the UNC system increased their square footage by 63%, and then they also decreased their EUI by 36. So what this tells us in the State Energy Office is that culture and mindset of the UNC system are the pinnacle of energy management. They have dedicated energy managers. They have funding mechanisms to fund energy projects. They have energy management teams. They have designated energy managers. They have a great conglomeration of a great way to manage energy, and they also have their base. Their students want energy efficiency. So as you can see, that the UNC system is catering to that, and they're really making great progress. I mean, they're a fantastic group, but the cabinet agencies right now are just really not pulling our fair share of the total. So next slide, please. So what have we done about this? So with this data, it raised a red flag for us, obviously, as part of that. But one thing that we have done recently was that we met with all of those 5 agencies that we've identified. So those top 5 are the big 5, to identify energy efficiency projects and buildings that could be targeted to assist with allowing cabinet agencies to proportionally assist with meeting the collective statewide 40% goal of all state-owned buildings by 2025. So what we have done is we identified well over 103 projects in 51 buildings across North Carolina, or in the cabinet agencies, that will assist with reducing overall EUI and pull us up, so that way we could potentially meet that 40% goal by the deadline. And you know, one thing is that although the reduction goal is directed towards the collective efforts of all state-owned buildings, cabinet agencies should, you know, proportionally contribute to our fair share and of the cumulative total. You know, separating cabinet agencies out as part of this analysis kind of shows the individual efforts and provide a sense of where agencies currently stand and what additional energy reductions are needed by agency. So this evaluation helped us to determine where to move next. So we're also, one other thing that we're doing as part of this analysis as well is we are, in our office, we're attempting to launch energy audits at identified top priority buildings within those big 5. So we're working hard and we're working on getting realistic projects in place that could really help us to achieve this goal by 2025. Next slide, please. So this slide right here shows us the results of these projections and where we'll be. So, you know, on the first column beside the agency name, you'll see that what's the EUI reduction by agency. So that's where each agency currently stands as of the last report that we received when compared to the baseline. So statewide, I mean, you know, for all cabinet agencies, we're at a 23%. Some are lower, some are higher, but collectively at a 23%. But with these estimated reductions for projects that we have identified with the agencies, we work hand in hand with them, work with their staff and energy managers to help develop projects. We have estimated that if we did these projects, it would jump them from a 23% to a 35% by 2025, which would help them to bring their fair share to the table, which could help us to meet the goal. One other thing that is to note in this is performance contracting. That can't be ignored. There are 2 agencies right now that are that have upcoming and PCs that we have included as part of this analysis to help meet that goal and as part of this reduction. But one thing that I will like to highlight is on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see that there's a circled amount. So each agency collectively, in order to meet this, we need funding. We need you know, $107 million in projects to help us to meet these goals with these projects that we have identified with these agencies. So there is a way, you know, there are different funding mechanisms coming down, whether it be through, you know, the infrastructure, whether it be from the R&R funds that was just set up for energy efficiency. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to do this, but this is realistically, this is where we stand to bring agencies up to this percent. So that way we can assist with meeting the goal. And we'll have a slide later on in this presentation that will show where each agency type, so cabinet agencies, other agencies in the UNC system needs to be to achieve that. And this is where, based on these results of this analysis. Next slide, please. So all these project categories that you saw a couple slides ago, where we had, you know, EUI or the EO80 projections, we had roughly 4 categories of projects. We had building envelope projects, electrical projects, mechanical projects, and other projects, which incorporated clean energy, you know, doing microgrids, doing community projects that not only benefit state buildings, but the nearby disadvantaged communities. So there was a lot of holistic thinking in this. So as you can see on this, the first thing that I would like to note for you is that the average construction time of this, of each of these, is roughly 12 to 18 months. So in other words, that is the time, like, after the procurement process is in place, after selecting vendors, this is the time from sticking the shovel in the ground to completing it. So as you can see, we have some work to do, because if we can get these projects done within this amount of time, we can still make significant progress. And it will also have a lot of energy savings annually, as well as monetary savings. So keep in mind that during this time, as part of this initiative, that we're also experiencing global supply chain disruptions and shortages, and as well as domestic labor challenges. So, keep that in mind as part of this construction time, that, this is based on, and that was incorporated into this as some thoughts, but this is currently where we stand, and we need the time, and we need the funding, and I believe that we could make significant gains. Next slide, please. So what's another thing that's on our minds right now? Well, competing priorities for energy usage in across the state. So one thing is adding new charging infrastructure for at agencies or even at the UNC system. So what are we going to do to offset that? Are we going to put in renewables to offset the increase in kWh? Or so what's the approach for that? Because as we all know, the square footage of the parking decks, at least for the agencies, many of the agencies, is incorporated as part of the square footage for our reports. So that's something to keep in mind. Another thing is adding brand new HVAC at correctional institutions or any other institution. One thing we need to keep in mind is that if we're going to add them, we should make them more energy efficient, make sure that they're Energy Star rated, have high SEER. So there's a lot with that. Other things is employees returning to work. When you come back to the office, you're going to use more energy than we did during the stay-at-home period during the pandemic. So as always, you're going to be printing more, copying more, using more lighting, using more heating and cooling. And you also have health and safety measures as well at the office, putting in high MERV filters and, outside air being incorporated into the building to make it healthier and safer for those inside. So in other words, what we're trying to get at with this is that we need to make sure that any other priorities as part of the state, which are great priorities, we need to make sure that they don't compete with each other and they have a holistic view and they work together. Next slide, please. So with this slide, what this is saying is that based on all these projections and what we just told you, so if we're able to get the funding that we need at $107 million, if we complete the construction prior to 2025 and we're able to get the data incorporated into the utility reports, so that way we can report on it during after the fiscal year 24-25 and or 25-26. And the gross square footage and energy use trends remain constant, so there's no major fluctuations. And by all we mean all competing priorities are offset in some way. Then we can achieve a 35% reduction for cabinet agencies by 2025, which will move us in a very positive direction. So so there is light at the end of the tunnel, and that kind of moves into the next slide, where we'll show what's needed. So with this information, so what's needed to meet this goal by 2025? So right now, this is a similar chart that you saw earlier today. The cabinet agencies are at a 23%, but if we move them to 35 with these projects, then and the UNC system keeps on their trajectory as we anticipate, and the other agencies are the same as well. They follow the same trend that they're following right now. We can meet the 40% goal by 2025. It's definitely doable. But we have to remember that the closer you get to the goal, the more expensive it is, because the low-hanging fruit are usually completed, and you're starting to work on envelope repairs. You're starting to work on different things that are more costly and is not as quick. So it takes more time to do the work. And one thing as well is that if you note the UNC system on here, that they'll probably make the 44% even more. But one thing is that the UNC system's improvements are dependent on a mechanism for funding, like House Bill 1292, which has impacted by the utility budgets. And something that we should note is that the fuel costs across the board and globally have increased for natural gas and other fuel types. So that could impact the number of projects that they can fund during this time period, because there are some companies and EIA is projecting that there may be some volatility in the oil markets or fuel markets for the next few years. So that's something to keep in mind, as well as other agencies. If I will note is that even if other agencies in the middle on this move from, instead of us putting 5% in there, if they made a 45% reduction, it would only move the needle of this total to 41%. So that's why it's so important for us to focus on cabinet agencies and the UNC system to meet this goal. So next slide, please. So what are the key takeaways from this? So one thing is that we need funding, $107 million for the identified projects that we have worked hand in hand with these agencies. Next is we need time to actually do the work, to construct it, to the procurement process. And keep in mind that those 12 to 18 months is per project. So if you have multiple concurrent projects, we can get a lot done, but you have to keep in mind that some of them may, you may have to wait because there may need to be one completed first, then you have to do another one. So you have to stagger them and make sure you're being good stewards of your time if you're doing multiple concurrent projects. One other thing is, which kind of goes back to some of the, competing priorities, is alternative generation to offset competing priorities, which is important. Are we doing rooftop solar? Are there any other mechanisms to reduce our demand or something similar? One other thing is, which we need, which was we saw was in the most recent budget, a recommendation is dedicated full-time energy managers and staff to oversee projects. That is critical. We need this. This is the difference between the state the state agencies and the UNC system is they have dedicated full-time staff, even teams, and we have some that are, a couple that are full-time, but most of them have other jobs or other priorities, and it's not their main job. The other thing is mandatory set points in buildings, building automation systems. In fact, there's some agencies that have vacant buildings that are using a lot of utilities. So, that's low-hanging fruit that we can knock out right there to get, some massive reductions. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Next step. So as we said before, we want to actively pursue funding, alternative funding opportunities. So whether it be the IIJA or infrastructure funds or bill, the NC, which is most recently implemented, the Energy Efficiency Repair and Renovation Funds, or R&R funds, which provides an opportunity to fund energy efficiency projects and throw the savings back into the bucket. The other thing is we need to streamline procurement processes. If we're going to do this, some agencies have long procurement processes that take weeks, if not months, to accomplish. So we have to think of a way to make that short, more streamlined and how to work more efficiently. Next is implement energy audits for these identified buildings, which is something that we've started, but we need more. We need to, have some vendors go out and as well as our team to go out and identify other areas that we may not have captured that could be incorporated into these projects to save more energy. And then the last thing is we need to proactively address challenges to our workforce or labor force shortages and potentially the supply chain disruptions as well, because we have a lot of vendors on different things that have had issues getting, copper for HVAC or getting, various materials that they need to complete a project or lighting or, so something to keep in mind. Most vendors have a lot of good supply networks and it's possible to get it done, but that's just something to keep in mind as well. So one thing I will note is that, DOT was one of the big, heavy hitters in the percent impact that we discussed earlier. But I will note that, for the R&R funds that we talked about a few seconds ago, they're not currently eligible for them because they're not supported from general funds. So they're going to have to think outside the box on funding for them, because with the incoming, infrastructure funds and other opportunities that are coming down the pipe, we could work with them to get a lot of funding to the state. As well as potentially legislative. So with that being said, next slide, that's our main update today. And we're happy to thank you for the opportunity to be here and speak with you about this update. Thank you.
Matthew, while you're discussing funding challenges, I would also like to interject in there. You mentioned the 1292 for the universities. And for anybody that doesn't know, that's related to House Bill 1292, which allows the universities to demonstrate their energy savings from projects. And then they ask for some of that funding back if they have it left in their utility budget. And then they're required to use at least 60% of those funds for ongoing energy projects. Agencies don't currently have a funding mechanism such as that. Paul Braze, who is energy manager with DPS, has been working with OSBM to get some credits and rebates and those types of things for demonstrated energy savings. But the more we can incentivize the agencies and help them to kind of build a snowball fund that they can use to carry forward with energy projects, that would help. Because the roadblock that Paul has hit with DPS is he gets the incentive, but then OSBM also cuts their utility budget. So it makes it even harder.
Thanks, Julie.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Julie. Are there any questions or comments from the council members? All right, hearing none. We all know this is an important issue in order for us to meet our EO 80 goals. I will note that there were no requests for public comment for this meeting. So at this time, on behalf of Secretary Advisor, who had to step away, I will adjourn the meeting. Thank you, everyone.